Morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my slides so we can get those up.
Morning, everyone. We've got Mandy Pearse with us today. I think everybody knows Mandy. So whilst Mandy sorts her screen out, let's show her a bit of emoji love. Welcome her on board. Just the emojis are at the bottom, and just some housekeeping. You can turn on your captions. There's a CC button next to the emojis and the reactions one that you can press if you want your captions on. And if you have any questions for Mandy, just drop them into the Q&A tab on the side. Mandy's going to be talking to us about strategic communications and about stakeholder engagement in particular.
I'm just going to reshare that because it's just done something slightly odd.
Don't worry. We've got a morning where our internet connections are playing up a bit, so please bear with us. I think we all are well aware of the internet problems that some of us have whilst working from home. But yeah, I will just wait for Mandy to bring that up for you.
So sorry.
It's fine. How's everyone doing today? Has everybody got their cups of tea? Do you want to show us your emoji if you've got a hot drink with you? Hey, okay. I forgot to bring mine, so I'm going to grab mine. But let's pass you over to Mandy and kick this off.
Okay, thank you ever so much, Nafisa. So I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about why I think stakeholder engagement lies at the heart of strategic public relations. And I'm going to take you actually on a little bit of a journey, and it's about my journey through my career and why stakeholder engagement has featured strongly throughout the whole time I've worked in public relations. So I'm just going to try and get the next slide to come up. There we go. So I'm going to cover a bit about my background, a little bit about some definitions and what I've learned in over 20 years, and bringing it all together a little bit. I thought it might be helpful to share a bit about me because I don't come from the standard PR background that most people do, and I'm hoping that will inspire those of you who, like me, don't come from perhaps a journalism or a traditional PR education background, that there are lots of opportunities and you can make a success of your career, even though perhaps you don't start from the same place as other people. So a bit about me. I'm the first in my family. I come from a fairly standard working class background. I'm the first in my family to go to higher education. I went to a polytechnic, which is now a university, but when I went there, it wasn't. My undergraduate degree has nothing to do with PR, it's science, a combined science degree. But what it taught me quite a lot about was the psychology of how people behave, the sociology about how societies behave, and quite a lot of maths and statistics. So quite a lot of the numbers stuff, as well as being able to write and present as well. I did a postgraduate in teaching, so that gave me some organisational confidence around presenting and talking and speaking. I later went back while I was working night school to do a master's in business, and I did that mainly I did it over 3 years night school because I wanted to be able to talk to other stakeholders in the business. I wanted to be able to talk to chief execs and finance directors in the language of business and be understood and respected at that level. And if I just talked about public relations, I didn't get that buy-in. So it was a bit about being able to talk to my key stakeholders in a more effective way. My work has been mainly public sector, so local authorities and governmental communications. But I've also worked, particularly in my consultancy, with a number of charities and worked with the private sector in terms of development, construction, engineering, some of the quite hard hat type stuff. Again, because I don't have standard qualifications or an undergraduate or master's degree in public relations, I did some studying to get diplomas. I put myself forward to be an accredited practitioner and a chartered practitioner and chartered marketer. So I went forward for both of those. I think it does give you credibility to be chartered professional, but I recognise it's not right for everyone at the right. It's got to be the right point in your career. My kind of career journey has been from research to working with communities to develop opportunities for communities, to services marketing to corporate PR. So again, not a standard route into the profession at all. And now I'm a company owner. I've owned my own business for 10 years and I'm a consultant and trainer. So it just gives you a bit of a flavour that I'm not, as I say, coming from the sort of standard background, and that other people who are different should be present in our industry, can be present in our industry. And it's really strengthens our industry to have lots of people from very diverse backgrounds. We are stronger and better for it. So never ever feel put off. Okay. So I wanted to just sort of do a couple of definitions. I'm not going to do loads of academic stuff because I think it is about us focusing on practice. But public relations is all about reputation, and we can control to a degree what our organisation does, and we can control to a degree what we say about our organisation. But the bit that is really difficult is the bit about what others say about you. And to me, that's why stakeholder engagement is really important, because if you have positive dialogue with your stakeholders, they are much more likely to talk positively about you and your organisation, which enhances your reputation. So it's about that point about earning understanding, support, and influencing opinion. And you don't get that by just broadcasting at people. And it's about mutual understanding. And mutual understanding is about two-way conversation. So if all you do is broadcast, you pump out positive pieces of PR about your organisation, what you do not get is engagement and buy-in. And longer term, in terms of your strategic PR approach, that actually doesn't benefit you or buy you a lot. And I think it's perhaps even more valid in a digital environment that you can engage and have rich conversations with your stakeholders online as well as in person, rather than, it's that point about if you put out information into social media and then you're not online when your stakeholders are discussing it, then you can't engage with them. So it really is about having those opportunities to have rich conversations and listen to people. I wanted to just sort of touch on stakeholders because it will probably be familiar to most people, but just in case it isn't, it is that wider view that stakeholders are people who are affected by our organisation or who can affect our organisation. So sometimes we think about staff and we think about customers and we think about shareholders, but there are loads of other people who are stakeholders in our organisation. They may be suppliers, they may be resellers, they may be intermediaries, it could be the media, it could be people whose livelihood also depend on your organisation thriving. So if you're the major employer in a city, lots of other businesses are reliant on you because your staff, your workers come in and then spend money with those other businesses. Without you, it impacts on them. So we have to think of ourselves as organisations within infrastructure, within our ecosystem. And therefore, it's that bit about thinking about all our stakeholders. Some we might decide are more important than others, and we need to pay more attention to them. But it's never to the exclusion of others. In the sort of late 90s, there was a sort of a vogue for customer is king. Everything is about the customer. As long as the customer's happy, then everything's fine. Well, actually, a lot of the businesses which were held up as the exemplars of customer actually didn't do very well because they didn't treat their staff very well. So they had industrial relations issues. They didn't necessarily think about their shareholder profits. So they had shareholders unhappy. And most of those companies that were being held up and lauded as the right thing to do are not with us today. So you have to be quite careful with that. Equally, there will be people who say that staff are the most important resource. As long as the staff are happy, then everything will be brilliant. Well, actually, that doesn't always fly either. I did my master's dissertation a lot around stakeholders, looking at the theory and looking at practice. And the reality seems to be that you need to pay attention to all your stakeholders. You need to engage with them. And if you do that effectively in a systematic way, it really will enhance your reputation and your strategic PR approach. And the other thing I wanted to talk about just briefly before I give some examples was engagement. A lot of the work around engagement, and I've shown the ladder of participation, which is a kind of core of engagement work, was developed by a lady called Sherry Arnstein in the 1960s in America. And she did a lot of work around social housing, around health services, around how cities work. And it's a really powerful paper to go and look at, because in some senses it's quite shocking that things you will have heard from Black Lives Matter were being talked about way back then. The idea that minority communities were not being listened to. When they stood up and spoke about their experience, it was ignored, and they were then criticised for having the temerity to raise the fact that they weren't treated fairly. And it's in some ways quite frustrating that we're still having those conversations. But good quality engagement is about that point about partnership, around delegating some power, about being able to let go of power. And that applies to us as PR professionals. If you want your stakeholders to coalesce and back your PR strategy and advocate for you, you actually have to give away a bit of power. So you stop being the leader and you maybe become the coordinator. And that's a quite different role. But it is about power, and you have to recognize that in terms of dealing with stakeholders. So I'm just going to give you some examples around my experience of working with stakeholders and why it impacts upon your reputation, and the kind of odd things that can happen, but that are really important. So small things really matter. I did a piece of work in one of my first jobs where I was working with a group of leisure centres. They couldn't quite understand why they had good profitability, great centres, but their reputation when they did satisfaction surveys was quite poor. And they asked me to go and talk to various stakeholders. So I went and talked to the staff, I went and talked to the customers, I went and talked to people who live around the leisure centres. And there were lots of small issues that needed resolving. And the thing was, they weren't big things, but they were affecting the reputation of the organisation. And I'm just going to give you really one silly example, but it's important because it is a small thing making a big impact. The leisure centre involved didn't have any clocks. Why does that matter? Okay, it matters because every customer who came in, whether it's badminton players or squash players or basketball players, everyone came in expecting to have access to the facility at a particular time. And because there was no version of the truth, no clock, they all argued all the time around, well, my watch says it's time for us to swap over. And the staff used to get involved in these debates, and it became quite a furious debating point. But it was really easy to resolve. It didn't cost hardly anything. Once it was played back to the management, that half the problem you're getting and the angst from all your customers and staff is just because you don't put some clocks up. that's resolvable in an instant. So sometimes the issues that stakeholders have are small. You can deal with them really quickly, and your reputation thrives because of it. The next example I wanted to give was about showing flexibility in your approach. I don't know where my screen just went. Okay. Okay. Can we do that? Thank you. Let's go to that next slide. Yeah, it's about showing flexibility in your approach. Sometimes we as PR professionals think we know it all. We know the right way to do things. So I wanted early on in my career I worked in an area with a high level of diverse communities. So Hindu communities, Muslim communities, Sikh communities. And I, as a young white woman, really didn't know the right way to go around talking to the communities. So I took advice from my then Race Equality Council. And what they said to me shocked me. And I hope life has moved on. But they said to me, you as a young white woman in your 20s, you need to get permission to do this from senior elders in the community. And to do that, you need to take with you a male boss. And I was horrified as a feminist that I needed to take my male boss with me to go and meet the elders to get the kind of sanction to go ahead with what I needed to do. But I had to put aside my pride and showed the flexibility. I went with my boss. I had a really great meeting with the elders from the different BME communities. And once they understood that I genuinely wanted to listen to what people had to say and to improve the cultural life of that community, I got the backing to go and access communities which I would never have been able to reach otherwise. And I had wonderful, rich conversations with Muslim women around what they wanted to do in terms of leisure and what would be appropriate and comfortable for them culturally. And we made real progress in the area I worked in, and a thriving cultural program came out of it, some of which, you know, I 30 years on, I can look at and see the seeds of what I was doing at that early point. But I take the point that you need to be flexible. You need to listen to your communities and your stakeholders and work with them in the way they want to be worked with. You cannot impose how you work with stakeholders. It has to be by consent. If we go to the next slide, I think you really have a duty with your stakeholders to, again, look wider than the obvious. Go out and seek those stakeholders with differing views who are not like your organisation, who perhaps your organisation has little interaction with, because they will give you real insight into what you can improve. And they may give you ideas and thoughts that you had never had. So it is about reaching beyond the obvious. Think about how you can get to stakeholders perhaps who are not, we can, as PR people, focus on the stakeholders who shout loudest. And often those are the people who have a level of privilege. Often it's the quiet people, the people who aren't speaking loudly, who we need to listen to and engage with. And we get better, richer solutions when we do that. Could I have the next slide, please? So how does this relate to our PR strategy? That they're kind of examples from when I used to do a much more community development role. In terms of, I used to work down in Lewes on the south coast of England. It's an area that has a rich tradition in the arts and particularly sculpture, linked very much to the Bloomsbury set, who moved out of London down to that area in the 1920s. And it was a very avant-garde period. There was a flourishing of LGBT couples who were very high profile at a time when that was not necessarily easy to do. And we wanted, I worked for the council in the area. And we wanted to harness that artistic tradition to build a new artistic flourishing community for the 21st century. And we engaged with all our artists and businesses to create a campaign to bring back a sculpture called The Kiss, which is in the Tate. It's a priceless sculpture by Rodin. It's a 2-ton statue, and it was sculpted for the owner of a property in Lewes, who was part of the Bloomsbury set. And by having our stakeholders on board, discussing strategy, doing all sorts of PR tactics over about 5 years, including launching a literary prize using money from the sale of a property Virginia Woolf had once lived in. We actually got to the point where after 5 years of campaigning, the Tate turned around to us and said, yeah, you can have the statue, which was like absolute shock. They're going to give us a priceless statue. And in the end, we held the biggest exhibition outside of France of Rodin's work. It brought huge amounts of income into the area. It created real opportunities for our artistic community to sell their work and to be more high profile. And in terms of the reputation of the area, it really enhanced it as an area that was friendly to LGBTQ members of the community, that had a flourishing artistic tradition. So we actually created something special that had real economic benefit to the community as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. The next example I'm going to give to you, I worked in Exeter. We had an Exeter, like parts of the southwest, is not all high income second home owners. There are pockets of deprivation all over the southwest. Some areas there are real challenges, and one of them is about high quality, high tech jobs. There are lots of seasonal, low paid jobs in the southwest, but having good all year round opportunities for people is really important. There was an opportunity, the Met Office were looking to relocate out of Bracknell, and we put together, by looking at our stakeholders across the city region, we looked at businesses, universities, colleges, local communities, local contractors who could potentially build a site, ICT infrastructure. So we brought all the stakeholders who had a vested interest in high quality jobs in the city together to again create a strategic PR campaign to relocate the Met Office with all its supercomputers and thousands of high-tech jobs to Exeter. And we had to compete really hard against lots of other areas that wanted to get that investment. But by doing so, we brought lots of new opportunities. And Exeter as a city has thrived since then on innovation. And there's a real cluster of tech type industries, some of them quite well known, that now reside in Exeter. So it became the catalyst for lots of improvements to the economy. And those benefits carry on well beyond. But it's all about getting all your stakeholders to say to government, to say to those who are going to make the decision, we want this, we will help, we will support this. And you have to get everyone on side. One organisation cannot leverage in these major hundreds of millions of pound investments. It just doesn't happen like that. On a small scale in Exeter, I also wanted to talk about building a customer centre. We, as a reputation as a local authority, we had a poor reputation for our customer service. We needed to turn that around. We felt that building a customer centre, and this was quite early when very few people had a bespoke customer centre, was the right way to tackle that. But we decided to have a co-creation approach from the outset. So that was to talk to our communities, our stakeholders, and we build and design with their input. So it's not about, here's a design, what do you think, and we go away. It's about, here's the first example of a design. How would you change it? How would you adapt it? How would you make it work for you? And it's an iterative, adaptive approach. And the sort of things that come out of that are things like, by engaging with the hard of hearing community, the early designs were all glass and chrome and hard floors. And our hard of hearing community said to us, this will be dreadful. We won't have a hope of being able to hear what anyone says. Can you please get rid of that? And can you put soft carpeting that will absorb sound? So we put in sound clouds and carpets and soft furnishing to get something where it didn't echo all over the place. We went to older people's groups and we showed them the furniture we were planning to put in. And they said, that's useless. It's horrible. There's no arms. How can an older person get up if there's no arms on the chair? Where's the space for a wheelchair user to sit with their family? So they challenged us all the way through, and the designs were improved and adapted because of that. And I found that I led the stakeholder engagement, and I found that an incredibly powerful opportunity to build something that was really designed with our stakeholders in mind. And it was things, one more example was that we put in privacy pods where people could discuss really difficult issues, like they might need to ask for help or benefits, and they didn't want to do those in public areas. So we created these really nice privacy pods that worked for people. And at the time we were doing that, that wasn't how those things were dealt with. You had to, sit in front of someone in a job centre at an open desk and disclose all your personal circumstances, which was just really uncomfortable and horrible for people. So you can really affect change that benefits customers, your communities, and your wider community in terms of jobs and income by engaging all the stakeholders. And if I could have one more slide, please. I'm going to give you one more example, which was developing a really effective public affairs strategy for Plymouth. Again, Plymouth is much more similar to, say, Bradford or Oldham than it is to most of the cities in the southwest. It's an industrial city with a big naval base. A lot of manufacturing goes on there, more than all of the rest of the south of England. But people's life expectancy varies all over the place. Rich parts of the city to poor parts of the city. Those on lower incomes have a 12-year difference in life expectancy. And that's shocking. And it's really important to build the economy and build strength and investment and opportunities into the city. But to leverage that, one organisation on its own can't do that. You have to talk to all the stakeholders and have an agreed public affairs programme, which is what you're going to lobby the government about. And every single one, whether it's the university vice chancellor or the chief executive of the bus group or the man who runs the award-winning theatre, every single one of those, the business leaders, the council leader, every single one needs to go to government, and when they have those opportunities of minister's ear, to sell the same message. This is what we need. This is what we can do for you. And this is the money that we need you to invest. And to get that buy-in, you have to talk to all those stakeholders and agree the public affairs programme. One organisation, in this case the City Council, cannot impose the public affairs programme on the city. It has to be a process of discussion and evolution and negotiation with your stakeholders. But what it did do, by getting all those senior leader figures together in one room over many years, and I was responsible for a couple of years of that, but there were many others involved, what it did deliver was real opportunities for investment. So, they have since 2019, we've had National Marine Park in Plymouth be created, the first in the UK. A huge arts and cultural facility has opened, over £180 million of private sector investment in the city centre. And it's meant that a city which has quite big challenges has weathered the COVID storm a lot better. And if you haven't been to Plymouth recently, set aside your preconceptions and go, because it's a fabulous city. Can I go to the next slide? The one thing I wanted to just also leave with you is go beyond the obvious. Sometimes there are people who put themselves forward as leaders of groups, whether that be a representative who speaks on behalf of disabled people, or someone who speaks on behalf of older people. I would always listen to those people and engage with them, but also go beyond them to some of the community directly and triangulate that what you're hearing from the leader is also what you're hearing from the community. Because sometimes those individuals aren't the best representatives of their community, and they have particular interests that they wish to pursue. And you need to be sure that all your stakeholders feel the same way. So it's just a caveat of try and be wide and inclusive and go deep, as well as go for the obvious suspects. So I could go to the next slide, please. So in summary, what I would say is that successful stakeholder engagement in terms of strategic PR, if you do it well and you do it comprehensively and systematically, you get better insight, much more rich quality insight to help you form your strategy. You come up with strategic choices that you as the senior PR practitioner would never have thought of. You know, you don't have the monopoly on great ideas, and sometimes one of your stakeholders will put forward a strategic direction you hadn't considered and is actually ultimately better than what you were thinking of. By engaging your stakeholders, you have real buy-in to shared objectives and vision, and that's powerful in terms of getting things done. You get greater advocacy because people feel that they have a stake in it, that they've been engaged, that they really want it to succeed. Whereas if you are imposing something on people, they don't necessarily go with it. They might tokenistically say they agree, but they don't actually do anything active. It gives you a diverse and inclusive approach, and people appear. And I say appear, you find advocates and enormously talented people in your community that you had never realized were there. And I use community in its widest sense there. And you really do bring people out into the space they should be in to occupy. You get the opportunity to share the resources, which in a public sector or third sector context is really important because budgets are really tight. And I believe that you get better, more powerful results from engaging your stakeholders in your strategic PR approach. So if I could go to the last slide. We're going to go to questions. I'm also available on most social media platforms. We also have our CIPR Global. And if stakeholder management has inspired you, it's actually the topic of our CIPR conference on the 9th and 10th of November. So if that's of interest to you, do take a look. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Okay. And I think Nafisa is joining me. Okay.
I was just coming up. It just took a minute there. That was really interesting, Mandy. Thank you for that. Everybody, let's show Mandy a round of applause. I thought there were some really actionable things and really simple things that we can take away from your experience and what you shared there. Not simple in the way that it's easy to do, but things that we can actually implement. So that was really good. And I know in the Guild, I spotted that Stuart Bruce left a comment in there as well, just talking about how he's really enjoying this session. So thank you for that. We have got a question that's come up by Kevin. It's quite a long one, so I'm just going to quickly go through this for you. So I think it starts, and it's a bit philosophical, this one. So if I read this out completely wrong, I am sorry in advance, Kevin. So he said, do you agree with the premise that in order to delegate power, we need to delegate responsibility too? And with that comes the need for those receiving the delegation to have a set of skills to hold on to. And the responsibilities. So I won't go into the example, but he has given an example of Brexit there. So he said, for example, with Brexit, we delegate the power to most people, whichever way they voted, but they didn't necessarily understand the issue, and they may not have had the experience of that whole international legislation, the economics and the social policy. So in that context, for example, how do we manage stakeholders to ensure that we're working together effectively and taking other ideas on board, but not opening the door to misinformation and mismanagement?
Okay, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
There is a piece around, if you're going to work openly and honestly with your stakeholders, around sharing the information and data in a transparent way. There's also a piece that sometimes your stakeholders, and I think this is what Kevin's sort of talking about, that your stakeholders may not have the skills and confidence to engage. So sometimes you actually have to build with them and with their support their skills to actually engage with the topics. Sometimes it's our fault that we don't make things easy enough to engage with. So things like citizens' juries in the past have been really powerful for allowing people to, over a period of months or sometimes even years, to assess evidence and to hear argument and to weigh up different views. And a really powerful example of that would be the Irish government convened a citizens' jury around abortion legislation, which is a very hot topic in Ireland, and over a long period of time discussed and debated it and came to some conclusions which they put forward to the government, which actually changed the legislation in the end of the day. But it is, you need to share accurate information and be very wary of misinformation. And I think, just to Kevin's point, we as PR professionals have an ethical responsibility to be accurate, to only base our campaigns on accurate information. And to me, if you're a professional and you're prepared to use misinformation to sway public opinion, then you're not a PR professional.
Great point. That's great. I know quite early on in the session you talked about earning trust and support rather than pumping information out. If you had, say, your top piece of advice on how people can do that in any organization, what would it be?
I think it's just to recognize, I suppose it's a point of humility, that we are professionals and we have our education and our experience, but we don't always have the lived experience that maybe our customers or stakeholders have. And it's a recognition that by engaging with those stakeholders, you gain more insight and you come up with different things that you perhaps wouldn't have considered. And that, so it is a collaborative process to me, not a imposed process.
Yeah, I actually love how you put stakeholders at the heart of everything. So especially in designing things, just involving them at each step of the journey rather than towards the end. Can I ask, because I think when you're talking, it sounds like it works. And I presume behind the scenes, there were lots of other challenges. Were there ever points where you were working with particular audiences and they were telling you something, but say in the local government or in a different organisation, higher up senior leaders were telling you to do something different? How did you manage the two different stakeholders?
Yeah, I think sometimes as PR people, we are in danger of trying to take on board the advocate role. And I think we have to be very conscious sometimes that we have a privileged position, which is not what our community have. and that we aren't necessarily the right person to even do that advocacy. So sometimes I think the most powerful thing is to actually just put the senior leaders in the room with the community. Now, that takes a bit of, you have to persuade people in power that that is going to be positive for them, that they will enhance their reputation by being seen to be willing to meet with people.
Mm-hmm.
That can be quite a hard sell, but when it's happened, I think leaders who've done it come away from it and say, that was really powerful. I really actually get it now, why people are annoyed with us, whether it's poor customer service or we're not providing the right type of services. And they do come away and they really find it impactful. But you have to be careful you don't become the advocate in the middle.
Yeah, I remember working in local government, and I remember one of the things that we actually tried was doing that in a bit of a controlled environment first. So getting lots of different representatives from across the I'd say towns, but getting them all in the room and having it as like a bit of an offline session, so nothing was shared externally, but it was still open and honest. And then doing the reaching out to the community. So I guess there's still some of that. You've just taken me back to those days now. We've got a few more questions which I'll go through. So I've got John Wilkinson from Scruffy Dog PR. He is asking, you mentioned the need to triangulate the wider community when engaging with community leaders. Do you have any thoughts on working with communities who believe they're leaders when you know that that individual may be misleading or misinforming the community, or they may have an agenda? I know you talked about this towards the end of your session, but do you have any additional thoughts on that, and what would you do in that instance?
I think that's just that point about being careful about the person who puts themselves forward as a leader, as to whether they are actually representative. And sometimes, as John was saying, sometimes even they've convinced their community to feel a particular way. I think that's where it's actually going out and talking sometimes one-on-one with people. So like individual interviews rather than group situations, because what you tend to get is in a group situation, particularly if the leader figure is there, everyone will go along with what the leader's saying because that's their comfort space. But if you talk to people on individual interviews and discuss things with them, you sometimes find that there is a variation in view, and that other leaders start to emerge because they begin to feel empowered. But it is, you have to treat it delicately. You know, I don't say that these people put themselves forward as leaders deliberately to mislead others, but sometimes they genuinely believe they've been the leader of the group for maybe 20 years, and they really believe that they passionately speak for that community. But the community has moved on. Young people have come in who have very different views, and you know, it's that evolution and trying to get them to understand that other people need to be given the opportunity to take forward things.
Yeah, and I guess that's interesting there as well, because I know you touched on the different communities, and we've talked about Bradford before we came onto here. But again, if I look at my experiences as compared to some of the leaders that we may have, or even if I look at my parents' generation, it's a completely different experience that they've had. And my wants and needs from the city will be very different from theirs. So I find that really interesting. I find it fascinating, especially because I also work in that space with students, and we see every year the needs are changing, the thinking is changing. So that's fascinating. Is there anything on how you would measure that, though? So measure the shift in how that community might be feeling over a particular period of time. Have you done anything like that?
Well, that's where, I mean, quantitative research, doing some tracking, some longitudinal tracking, where you're asking the same question year in, year out, to a representative sample over time, allows you to try and see some of those shifts. But it'll only give you the feel that the ground is shifting, and then you have to add the rich conversations which give you more information about why are people wanting it in a different way.
Yeah. And then we've got one last question from Sarah that I'm going to ask here. So Sarah has asked if you can suggest any capacity building strategies for communities to respond to engagement. So particularly as most community associations are volunteers.
Yeah, and again, this is where we really, in the public sector and the charitable sector, and sometimes in the private sector, we ask a huge amount from what are volunteers in the community. So sometimes it's about actually bringing in someone like, sometimes it's I'm trying to think, I'm struggling to think of the community volunteer service, or sometimes there are charitable funds which are available to then give to community associations so that they can then work with a provider to enhance their capacity to deal with things. So it might be that they need more confidence in chairing meetings, and the community voluntary services will provide that kind of training for people, but you need to find some funding. So sometimes, yeah, it is a case of building the capacity for the community to then engage, and that's why it's long term. You know, stakeholder engagement is a long term activity, but whether you're a public sector organisation who isn't going anywhere, a charity that wants to really achieve things, or whether you're a business, you've got to invest for the long term. It's not PR strategy is not about one campaign. It's about how we work with our communities over a long period of time. So I think you need to put some investment in.
Definitely. I found it really interesting, that point around volunteers. I know lots of the audience here probably joined the Power and Influence chat, and I was hoping we could ask you some questions on that, but I know we're running out of time now. But there was a comment I saw this morning, I think it was by Ben Verinder, and he just said it's just interesting, and trying to remember that people are volunteers as well, and I think that's at the heart of it. We need to. I know Asif touched on in yesterday's session, but sometimes if there is a community and people are volunteering, I guess from the other side of it, as the people that are needing something from that community, remembering that people are volunteers and they will have a million other things that they're doing at the same time. So it's just balancing that as well.
Yeah, I think we're very conscious of that. And, obviously, as president, I'm a volunteer. All my board are volunteers. They're not paid either. Our council are all volunteers, our group chairs, and we have about 700-800 volunteers at CIPR who are all absolutely brilliant. And it is finding ways to thank them for what they do. We want to invest in them. We had planned to do a volunteer conference in 2019. That didn't happen because COVID kind of knocked it. That the purpose was to have a face-to-face volunteer conference where people could really get together and look for solutions and have opportunities to have conversations and engage. We haven't been able to do it. We decided we didn't want to do it virtually because we didn't feel it would give the benefit to the volunteers. So it's still on the agenda for 2022. I know Rachel's, we've been talking about it. So it's still something we really, really want to do. So we'll watch that space for that one.
Yeah, keeping everything crossed for that. Let's give everybody a round of applause, especially all of the volunteers out there, because I know there's going to be lots of people here that that do lots of things outside of their usual day jobs. So thank you, Mandy. That was a really interesting session. I've taken away so much from it, and I'm going to be listening back to it again. Mandy is on all of the social networks if you have any questions for her. We're going to head into a break now. Remember to take pictures of yourselves, take your selfies whilst you're on the tables, and share them on social using the hashtag commsHERO for a chance to win some prizes. We have some Sharpies, we have some vouchers. I think there are some other things on grabs as well, notepads and other things. There's a real FOMO when the prizes get announced. I know there was a round of announcements yesterday and there was some FOMO on social, so don't miss out on that. After this session and after the break, we've got Chloe coming up. So Chloe Marshy will be talking about virtual events and whether they are as good as face-to-face. So that will be another one to listen to. Thank you so much, Mandy, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. Really nice to be here.